In the dark and freezing December of 1940, the future of Western civilization hung by a thread. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but on the ground, the Blitz was tearing London apart, and German bombs were flattening industrial cities like Coventry and Liverpool. On the world map, the British Empire still looked enormous, stretching across a quarter of the globe, but inside the underground war rooms of Whitehall, Britain's leaders knew a terrifying truth. The empire was not only bleeding soldiers, it was bleeding money, fast. Winston Churchill, whose speeches were inspiring the free world, sat deep underground and wrote one of the most important letters of his life. It was addressed to Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Churchill, master of words, now faced humiliation. He had to admit that Great Britain, once the world's banker and industrial giant, was running out of cash. The letter described the desperate military situation, German U-boats choking Atlantic supply lines and Britain's urgent need for ships, aircraft, and weapons. But the most painful truth came at the end. Churchill confessed that Britain was approaching the moment when it could no longer pay for survival. The people would fight on the beaches, he wrote, but without ammunition, courage alone was useless. It was a plea and an admission of insolvency. When the war began in 1939, Britain was still financially powerful. It held vast gold reserves and owned valuable investments across the world, railways in Argentina, mines in South America, and major industries in the United States. London remained the heart of global finance and shipping. But this war was different. It was a war of machines, consuming steel, oil, and rubber at unimaginable rates. Britain had to import almost everything, and with Europe under Nazi control, only the United States could supply what Britain needed. America, however, was officially neutral. The public was deeply isolationist, haunted by memories of World War I. Congress had passed neutrality acts that allowed Britain to buy weapons only under strict cash-and-carry rules. Pay immediately, transport them yourself, no loans, no credit. For 1 year, Britain drained its treasury to comply. In a secret operation known as Operation Fish, the government shipped the nation's gold across the Atlantic to Canada under constant threat from German submarines. It was the largest transfer of physical wealth in history. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The dollars were gone. British officials in Washington sat staring at unsigned contracts for planes and tanks they could no longer afford. When Roosevelt read Churchill's letter, he understood the stakes. If Britain fell, America would be next. But he also knew he could not simply hand over money. He needed a solution that looked like business, not charity. That solution would soon become known as Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease was presented to the American public as an act of generosity. President Roosevelt explained it with a simple metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him a hose. You lend it, and he returns it when the fire is out. It sounded humane, practical, and fair. Behind closed doors, the reality was far harsher. This was not neighborly help. It was a financial reckoning. The man overseeing America's purse was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. He wanted Britain to defeat Hitler, but he was determined that American taxpayers would not be fooled. Before a single dollar of aid was given, Britain had to prove it was truly broke. Morgenthau demanded a full audit of the British Empire. Every government asset, every private investment, every factory, every share owned by British citizens anywhere in the world had to be declared. British negotiators were stunned. They were being treated not as allies, but as a bankrupt corporation under investigation. Britain argued that it had already sold its gold and that liquidating long-term investments during wartime would be disastrous. Selling profitable companies in a hurry would mean accepting pennies on the dollar and destroying Britain's post-war future. Morgenthau refused to bend. His logic was brutal. If Britain still owned assets in America, why should American farmers pay for British tanks? The most painful example was American Viscose Corporation, the largest rayon manufacturer in the United States. It was hugely profitable and owned by a British company. The dividends helped Britain survive. Morgenthau targeted it immediately. He demanded it be sold, with the proceeds handed directly to the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons. Britain resisted, knowing the company was worth over $100 million. Selling it under pressure would be financial suicide. Morgenthau issued an ultimatum: sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease would die in Congress. Under emergency war powers, the British government seized the company and forced its sale. Because the sale was distressed, American bankers drove the price down mercilessly. American Viscose was sold for roughly $54 million, far below its real value. The dollars went straight to Washington, while Britain absorbed the loss. It was the moment Britain's elite realized the truth. This was not partnership. It was survival at any cost. At the same time, another deal reshaped global power. Britain desperately needed destroyers to protect Atlantic supply lines from German submarines. Roosevelt agreed to give Britain 50 obsolete World War I destroyers, but not for free. In exchange, the United States demanded 99-year leases on British naval and air bases across the Atlantic and Caribbean. From Newfoundland to Jamaica and Trinidad, Britain handed over strategic territory that would project American power for generations. For 50 aging ships, the United States gained a permanent military footprint across the Western Hemisphere. It was a geopolitical fire sale, trading long-term influence for short-term survival. By the time Lend-Lease became law in March 1941, Britain had been stripped bare. The gold was gone, the investments were being sold, the bases were leased. The empire survived, but only by surrendering its economic future. Hidden inside the Lend-Lease agreement was a clause known as Article 7. In return for aid, Britain agreed to dismantle its imperial trade system after the war. This system had protected British industry by favoring trade within the empire. By signing Article 7, Britain agreed to open its markets to American competition. It was an economic death sentence disguised as diplomacy. With German bombers overhead and the Atlantic under siege, Britain had no choice. It signed. After Pearl Harbor, Britain and the United States were finally fighting side by side. American troops flooded into Britain, and the island became a vast launching pad for the Allied war effort. But economically, the gap between the two nations only widened. American industry exploded under wartime spending. Factories expanded, efficiency soared, and the U.S. economy grew year after year. Britain's economy, meanwhile, was cannibalized by the war. Every factory was converted to military production. Civilian exports vanished, and Britain abandoned markets in Asia and Latin America. American companies quickly took their place. By 1944, the transfer of global wealth was complete. Gold reserves shifted from London to Fort Knox. Financial power crossed the Atlantic. Britain assumed its sacrifice would be rewarded after victory. It believed Lend-Lease would continue during the transition to peace. It expected gratitude. That hope collapsed instantly. On August 15, 1945, the war ended. Celebrations erupted across Britain. But in Washington, there was no sentiment. 7 days later, President Harry Truman terminated Lend-Lease without warning. Aid stopped immediately. Ships carrying food and supplies to Britain were ordered to turn back mid-Atlantic. The lifeline was cut. Britain was stunned. Its economy was still structured for total war. Without Lend-Lease dollars, the country was bankrupt overnight. Economist John Maynard Keynes saw disaster approaching: food shortages, unemployment, and economic collapse. Britain had only one option left: to beg. In late 1945, a sick and exhausted Keynes traveled to Washington, not as a negotiator, but as a supplicant. He asked for a grant, payment for Britain's sacrifice in holding back Hitler while America remained neutral. The Americans refused. There would be no gift, only a loan with interest and harsh conditions. Britain accepted a $3.75 billion loan in 1946. The most dangerous condition was sterling convertibility. Britain was forced to allow anyone holding pounds to exchange them freely for dollars. Keynes warned this would trigger a run on the currency and drain Britain's reserves. He was right. In July 1947, convertibility began. Within weeks, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars as the world dumped sterling for American currency. After just 5 weeks, the policy collapsed. Britain suspended convertibility in humiliation, having burned through much of the loan for nothing. The consequences were immediate. Britain abandoned its global commitments. In 1947, it told the United States it could no longer support Greece and Turkey. This message triggered the Truman Doctrine and marked the official transfer of global leadership from London to Washington. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound from $4.86 to $2.80. Overnight, the nation became dramatically poorer. Austerity defined daily life. Even bread was rationed in peacetime. The debt lingered for generations. The 1946 loan was not paid off until December 29, 2006, 60 years after the war ended. Britain had won militarily, but lost economically. Germany was defeated, but the United States emerged as the true victor. Its industry thrived, its wealth multiplied, and its influence replaced the British Empire without firing a shot. When Churchill wrote to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved Britain from Nazi conquest, but he also signed away the empire's future. Britain traded power for survival. It emerged as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. The empire did not collapse. It was sold piece by piece to pay the price of victory. I'm Solomon, and this is the Civilizations and Capital channel. Subscribe now to stay acknowledged.